For Gloria, at 63 years old, 41 years of marriage ended on a Tuesday morning with a notarized document slid across a kitchen table and a husband who didn't even look up from his phone. Frank kept the house, the savings, the rental property, and, somehow, the sympathies of both their adult children. Her settlement was $28,000, a number his attorney had described as more than fair for a woman who had spent 4 decades building a life she no longer legally owned. When Gloria used the last of that money to purchase a locked, abandoned house that hadn't been opened in over 30 years, a house the county had tried and failed to sell 7 times. Every person who knew her name said the grief had finally broken her. But Gloria had walked through that front door and seen something no one else had bothered to look for. And what she found inside that house, and what she ultimately rebuilt within herself, the restorer, the historian, the woman with 30 years of architectural knowledge she had quietly shelved to become someone's wife, would leave an entire town speechless and change everything she thought she understood about second chances. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Gloria Harmon had spent 41 years being the kind of woman people described as steady. Not glamorous, not ambitious in any way that made others uncomfortable, just steady. She showed up. She held things together. She managed the calendar and remembered the anniversaries and kept the household running with the quiet, invisible efficiency of someone who understood that the machinery of a family only works when somebody is always watching the gears. For 41 years, that somebody had been Gloria. She was 63 years old when Frank sat down across from her at the kitchen table on a Wednesday morning in late February and told her he wanted a divorce. He said it the same way he might have told her the dishwasher needed servicing. Matter of fact, slightly inconvenienced, already mentally moved on to the next item on his agenda. He had already spoken to an attorney. He had already begun the process of separating their finances. He had, she would later discover, already signed a lease on an apartment across town, a 2-bedroom in a new development that his 29-year-old girlfriend, a woman named Tanya who worked in his accounting firm, had apparently helped him choose. Gloria didn't scream. She didn't throw anything. She sat very still and looked at the man she had married at 22 years old and felt something she would struggle to name for weeks afterward. Not grief exactly, and not rage, but something cold and clarifying, like a window being thrown open in a room that had been sealed too long. The divorce moved quickly. Frank's attorney was efficient and thorough. Gloria's attorney, a kind but overworked woman named Patricia, who operated out of a small office on the edge of downtown Knoxville, Tennessee, did what she could. But the architecture of their financial life had been built in Frank's name. The house on Birchwood Drive, where Gloria had lived for 27 years, where she had painted every room and planted every garden bed and replaced the kitchen cabinets with her own research and taste. That house was titled solely in Frank's name. He had insisted on that arrangement back in 1983, explaining with the confidence of a man who had never questioned his own judgment that it was simpler for the business taxes. Gloria had agreed. She had loved him, and she had trusted him, and she had not yet learned that love and legal documentation are entirely separate instruments. The settlement was $28,000. Frank's attorney explained it was generous. His half of what remained in their joint checking account, after he had moved the substantial majority of their savings into account Gloria had no access to. The house was worth $380,000. They had lived there for 27 years. Gloria had made it what it was in every sense that mattered and in precisely none of the senses that the law recognized. Her son, Marcus, called her 3 days after she moved into an extended-stay motel off the highway. His tone was careful, rehearsed. "Dad told me about the settlement, Mom. $28,000 is actually pretty reasonable given the circumstances." The circumstances, Gloria repeated quietly. "Well, the house was in his name. Legally, he didn't have to give you anything. I lived in that house for 27 years, Marcus. I raised you in that house." "I know, Mom, but you have to be practical. You need to figure out your next steps. Have you thought about moving somewhere smaller? Maybe closer to Aunt Diane?" Gloria had understood something then, a slow and terrible understanding that settled in her chest like sediment. Marcus had chosen his father's side, not dramatically, not with cruelty, but with the quiet pragmatism of a man who had his father's ear and his father's business connections, and had calculated, perhaps without even realizing he was calculating, which relationship was worth protecting. Her daughter, Simone, was warmer, but ultimately no different. She called a week later from Portland, her voice soft with a sympathy that didn't extend to any practical action. "Mom, I've been thinking about you constantly. This whole situation is just awful. But I also think, and I say this with love, that maybe this is an opportunity. Like, you've spent so long taking care of everyone else. Maybe now you get to figure out what you actually want." "What I want," Gloria said, "is to not have been left with $28,000 after 41 years. I know, it's not fair, but Dad has already moved on, and I just think fighting it is going to drain you. You should take that money and do something good with it. Travel. Take a class. I don't know." Gloria ended the call politely and sat in the motel room with its smell of industrial cleaning product and its single window overlooking the parking lot, and understood, with complete clarity, that she was entirely on her own. She was 63 years old. She had $28,000, a pension from the 3 years she had worked as an architectural history researcher before Marcus was born that paid $640 a month, and no plan whatsoever. Frank and Tanya had moved into the house on Birchwood Drive. Marcus had attended their housewarming. Simone had sent a gift basket. Gloria had spent 41 years disappearing into the shape of other people's needs, and now she sat alone in a motel off a Tennessee highway, and the question that kept returning to her, not with despair, but with something stranger and sharper and almost like curiosity, was this: who exactly had she been before she became so useful to everyone else? She was going to find out. She just didn't know yet that the answer was waiting for her behind a locked door that no one had opened in 32 years. Gloria Harmon was born in Asheville, North Carolina, the second of 3 daughters raised by a father who restored old buildings for a living and a mother who taught high school English and believed, with quiet ferocity, that women should know how to do things. Real things. Practical things. Not just the decorative skills that were still being quietly pushed on girls in the 1970s, but actual knowledge, the kind that lived in your hands and your mind and couldn't be taken from you regardless of what life decided to do. Her father, a broad-shouldered, soft-spoken man named Earl Whitfield, spent his weekends taking Gloria through the old houses he worked on, teaching her to read a building the way other fathers taught their daughters to read music. He showed her how to identify construction periods by the width of floorboards and the profile of crown molding. He taught her the difference between load-bearing and decorative elements, between original plaster and 20th century patch jobs, between a house that had been well cared for and one that had been quietly neglected for decades beneath a fresh coat of paint. He taught her that old buildings were not problems to be demolished. They were documents to be read, stories to be understood, and with enough knowledge and patience, lives to be restored. Gloria loved it with an immediacy that surprised even her. By the time she was 16, she was accompanying her father to job sites and contributing real observations that his colleagues occasionally stopped to write down. By the time she graduated high school, she had already decided what she was going to do with her life. She enrolled in the architectural history program at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville, one of only 4 women in her cohort, and she was, by every measure her professors applied, exceptional. Her thesis, completed in 1979, focused on the documentation and restoration methodology of late 19th century vernacular architecture in the Appalachian region. Farmhouses, mill buildings, rural churches, the kind of structures that official preservation efforts routinely overlooked in favor of grander landmarks. Her faculty advisor called it the best undergraduate thesis he had supervised in 11 years. She had already been accepted to a graduate program at the University of Virginia when she met Frank Harmon at a party thrown by a mutual friend in the spring of her senior year. Frank was 26, dark-haired, and possessed of a confidence that Gloria had mistaken at 22 for substance. He was starting a property development company with a college friend and had big plans and a persuasive way of describing them that made everything sound not just possible, but inevitable. He was attentive and funny, and he made Gloria feel, in those early months, like the most interesting person in any room they entered together. They married 8 months after they met. Her mother had been worried about the speed. Her father had said very little, which Gloria later understood had been its own form of concern. The graduate program at Virginia was deferred once, then again, then quietly surrendered. Marcus arrived 14 months after the wedding. Simone, 3 years after that. Frank's development company began to grow, which meant entertaining clients and managing a household that was also a professional asset, a showroom for Frank's success, and which meant Gloria needed to be present and organized and gracious in ways that consumed exactly the hours she might otherwise have spent on her own work. She didn't stop caring about his store preservation. She never stopped. She subscribed to journals and read them during the children's nap times. She volunteered briefly with the County Historical Society until Frank pointed out that her volunteer work was creating scheduling complications for his client dinners. She kept a shelf of her university textbooks in the bedroom closet behind the winter coats, where she could take them down quietly on evenings when Frank worked late and spend an hour with the material that had once been the center of her entire intellectual life. She told herself it was temporary. She told herself she would go back to it when the children were older, when the business was more established, when Frank needed her less at decided events, when the timing was better. The timing was never better. The years move the way years do, when you're busy and necessary and surrounded by people who depend on you, quickly, quietly, without announcing themselves, until one morning you're 63 years old and sitting in a motel room and the graduate program acceptance letter is 40 years in the past, and the textbooks are in a storage unit across town, along with every other artifact of the person you had been planning to become. What Frank had taken from Gloria in the divorce, the house, the savings, the security, was significant, but it was not. She had begun to understand in those long, silent evenings in the motel room the most important thing he had taken. The most important thing was time. 41 years of it. 41 years during which she had set herself aside so completely, so habitually, so thoroughly, that even she had almost forgotten what she had originally been made of. Almost, but not quite. And that small, stubborn remainder of herself was about to become everything. Gloria spent the first 2 months after the divorce the way most people spend the early period of a catastrophic loss, moving through the basic motions of survival, while the larger reality slowly became undeniable. She ate. She slept badly. She drove to the storage unit and sat in the parking lot without going inside. She called Patricia, her attorney, twice about whether the settlement could be revisited, and Patricia explained both times, gently but clearly, that it could not. She watched her $28,000 shrink against motel fees and grocery runs and the quiet, relentless arithmetic of a life that costs money every single day, regardless of whether anything meaningful is happening in it. By month 3, she was searching real estate listings with the focused desperation of someone who understands that the window is closing. Knoxville's rental market had become brutal. Anything habitable within the city cost more per month than her pension covered. She widened her search. She looked at small towns, at rural counties, at properties far enough from anything convenient that other buyers had passed them over. She was not looking for comfort. She was looking for something she could afford and hold on to, something that couldn't be taken from her the way everything else had been taken. She found a listing on a Thursday night in April on a county property database she had stumbled onto while searching for tax-delinquent land parcels. It was filed under a category labeled Distressed Residential, and the entry was sparse. A single-family dwelling in Calder County, approximately 1,400 square feet, construction date estimated 1887, current condition unknown, last occupied 1991. The county had attempted to auction the property 7 times over the past 2 decades. It had not sold. The asking price had been reduced repeatedly and now stood at $11,500. There were no interior photographs. There were 2 exterior images, grainy and taken from a distance, showing a structure half consumed by overgrown vegetation, its front porch sagging on one side, its windows dark and intact behind decades of grime. Most people scrolling past that listing would have seen a liability, a money pit, a condemned structure waiting to become a demolition expense. Gloria looked at those two photographs for a long time and felt something she had not felt in years. The particular precise alertness of a mind encountering a problem it was specifically built to solve. She drove out the following Saturday morning. The property was 50 minutes east of Knoxville, accessible by a county road that narrowed to a single lane for the last half-mile. When she pulled off onto the gravel shoulder and got out of her car, the first thing she noticed was the silence. Deep, total, rural silence broken only by birdsong and the distant sound of wind moving through mature hardwood trees that lined the property's northern edge. The house sat on approximately 2 acres of overgrown land. The vegetation had advanced aggressively. Vines climbed the exterior walls to the roofline, shrubs had colonized the porch, and a large oak growing too close to the southeast corner had sent roots under the foundation. But Gloria was not looking at the vegetation. She was looking at the bones. The structure was a late Victorian vernacular farmhouse, almost certainly built between 1885 and 1895, based on the proportions of the windows and the profile of what remained of the decorative porch trim. The exterior siding was original wood clapboard, weathered to a silver gray, but structurally present beneath the vine coverage. The roofline was intact. Both chimneys were standing. The foundation, a hand-laid stone base of the type common to the region in that period, appeared solid from the exterior. No visible separation, no dramatic settling on the visible sides. She walked the perimeter carefully, documenting with her phone camera, reading the building the way her father had taught her 45 years ago. The south-facing wall had protected the siding best. The porch would need full reconstruction, but the main structure showed no signs of catastrophic failure. Every window she could reach appeared to have its original glass. Wavy, slightly imperfect, irreplaceable antique glass that restoration purists paid significant premiums to source. The front door was padlocked. The county property office held the key. Gloria stood on the collapsing porch and pressed her palm flat against the wood of the door, which was original and solid, and had been painted at least 4 times in its life based on the paint buildup visible at the edges, and felt the particular stillness of a place that has been sealed and waiting. She called the county property office from the car before she had even driven back to the main road. She asked about the inspection process and the purchase timeline, and whether the interior had been assessed recently. The clerk told her the last interior inspection had been conducted in 2003 and had noted the structure as deteriorated but not condemned. Gloria thanked her, ended the call, and sat for a moment looking at the house through her windshield. She bought it 9 days later for $11,200, leaving her with $16,800 and no certainty whatsoever about what came next. The first time Gloria unlocked the front door and stepped inside the house on Calder Road, she stood completely still in the entrance hall for almost 3 minutes. Not from hesitation, from reverence. The interior was exactly what 32 years of sealed abandonment looked like. Thick dust on every horizontal surface, cobwebs draped across the ceiling corners like gauze curtains, wallpaper peeling away from the plaster in long, curling strips, the smell of old wood and damp and time compressed into something almost tangible. 2 birds had found their way in through a gap in the attic eave and nested in the parlor. A family of raccoons had been living in the back bedroom, evidenced by the damage to the baseboard and the unmistakable presence they had left behind. But beneath all of it, beneath the decay and the abandonment and the decades of sealed silence, the house was extraordinary. The entrance hall had its original heart pine flooring, wide plank boards that ran the full length of the house, buried under grime but intact. The plaster walls, though cracked and stained, were original lime plaster applied over handsplit lath, the kind of wall surface that modern restorers spent enormous sums trying to replicate. The staircase was original, its turned balusters still present and solid, its newel post a beautifully proportioned piece of local craftsmanship that had survived 3 decades of abandonment without a single break. In the parlor, the fireplace surround was intact. Original carved wood with a cast iron insert, the mantelpiece still bearing faint traces of its original paint color beneath layers of later coats. Gloria walked through every room with her phone camera and her father's eye, documenting everything, cataloging what was present and what was missing, reading the house as the historical document it was. The kitchen had been modernized at some point in the mid-20th century and would need complete reconstruction. The back bedroom where the raccoons had lived required significant repair. The bathroom was a later addition and had no preservation value whatsoever. But the core of the house, the entrance hall, the parlor, the dining room, the two front bedrooms upstairs, was a remarkably intact example of Appalachian vernacular Victorian architecture that any preservation organization in the state would have recognized as significant. Gloria recognized it immediately, and then she rolled up her sleeves. She moved onto the property in early May with a tent, a sleeping bag, a camp stove, and the methodical determination of someone who has decided that discomfort is simply a variable to be managed. She was 63 years old and sleeping on the ground in a house that had no running water, no functioning electrical system, and no heat beyond a small propane heater she positioned near her sleeping bag on cold nights. She did not allow herself to think about what her life had looked like 18 months earlier. The king-size bed on Birchwood Drive, the functioning kitchen, the security of a life that had turned out to be built entirely on someone else's legal title. She thought instead about the work. The first month was cleaning and assessment. Gloria cleared the raccoon damage, removed the bird nests, swept and vacuumed and wiped down every surface, opened every window that could be opened to let 32 years of stale air escape. She pulled back loose wallpaper carefully, documenting the layers underneath. 4 distinct periods of decoration. The oldest layer, a beautiful pattern of small geometric repeats in ochre and cream that dated almost certainly to the original occupation of the house. She photographed everything. She took notes in a composition notebook she kept in her jacket pocket, filling pages with observations, measurements, questions, and the beginnings of a restoration plan. She called the County Historical Commission in the 3rd week, identifying herself as the new owner and asking about designation eligibility. The woman she spoke with, a quietly enthusiastic preservation officer named Brenda Cook, asked for the address, pulled up the file, and said with genuine surprise that the property had been flagged for potential historic significance years ago, but had never had an owner willing to pursue designation. If Gloria was interested in pursuing it, Brenda said there were grant programs available for certified historic structures, rehabilitation tax credits, resources that could meaningfully offset restoration costs. Gloria wrote it all down and read her notes 3 times that night by lantern light. The physical work was harder than she had anticipated, and she had anticipated it being very hard. Her body, which had spent decades in the comfortable sedentary routine of a well-managed household, protested with remarkable specificity. Her shoulders ached from scraping and sanding. Her knees complained about the hours spent crawling across floors doing close inspection work. Her hands blistered, then calloused, then blistered again in new places as each task demanded a different grip and motion. But something else was also happening, something quieter and more significant than the physical discomfort. With every layer of paint she carefully removed, with every piece of original material she documented and preserved, with every decision she made alone based entirely on her own knowledge and judgment, Gloria Harmon was remembering who she was. The preservation community in Tennessee is smaller and more interconnected than most people outside it realize. Word travels through it the way word travels through any specialized world, through conference attendance and journal subscriptions and the particular informal network of people who care deeply about the same obscure thing. So when Brenda Cook from the County Historical Commission mentioned to a colleague at a regional preservation conference in June that a woman had purchased the Calder Road property and appeared to be conducting a serious restoration effort single-handedly, it didn't take long for that information to reach the right ears. The right ears, in this case, belonged to a man named Arthur Bellamy. Arthur was 71 years old, a retired professor of architectural history from the University of Tennessee who had spent his career documenting and advocating for the preservation of vernacular structures across the Appalachian region. He had written 2 books, contributed to a dozen preservation surveys, and spent 40 years watching properties exactly like the Calder Roadhouse get demolished, neglected, or sympathetically destroyed by well-meaning owners who lack the knowledge to restore them correctly. He drove out on a Tuesday afternoon in late June without calling ahead, which Gloria would later tell people was either very rude or the best thing that ever happened to her, depending on the day. She was on the porch roof when he arrived, carefully removing deteriorated wood shingles and documenting the original sheathing boards beneath. She heard a truck pull up and looked down to find a compact, white-haired man standing in the overgrown front yard with his hands in his pockets, looking at the house with an expression she recognized immediately because she had worn it herself the first day she came here. The expression of someone seeing something that matters. She climbed down, and they introduced themselves, and Arthur walked the property for 45 minutes without saying much, which Gloria found she didn't mind at all. When he finally spoke, he said, "The interior trim in the parlor is original. I wasn't expecting that." "Neither was I," Gloria said. "The whole parlor is essentially untouched." Arthur was quiet for another moment. Then he said, "What's your background?" She told him. He nodded slowly. "Graduate program at Virginia. Accepted. Never attended." He looked at her steadily. "Well," he said, "you're attending now." Arthur became a fixture at the property over the following months, visiting 2 or 3 times a week. He brought knowledge that filled the gaps in Gloria's own, specific technical expertise about period-appropriate restoration methods, contacts within the preservation materials supply network, and a detailed familiarity with the Grant landscape that transformed what Brenda Cook had described in general terms into a concrete financial strategy. He helped Gloria prepare the application for state historic designation, a process requiring meticulous documentation that consumed weeks of work, but which, when approved in September, unlocked access to a 20% federal rehabilitation tax credit and eligibility for 2 state preservation grants. The designation also brought visibility. A photographer from a regional architecture magazine, connected to Arthur through his professional network, came out to document the restoration in progress. The resulting feature, published in the magazine's fall issue, showed the house in careful before and after photographs that captured both the extraordinary original fabric Gloria had uncovered and the quality of the restoration work being done to preserve it. The article described Gloria's background, her methodology, and the significance of the structure itself, and it was read by exactly the right person at exactly the right moment. That person was Dr. Lena Park, a historic preservation specialist at the Tennessee State Historic Preservation Office, who had been searching for properties to include in a new statewide initiative promoting adaptive reuse of rural historic structures. She contacted Gloria the week the article published. She visited the property in October, spent 3 hours going through every room with Gloria, and left with a proposal. Would Gloria consider allowing the house to be designated as a demonstration site for the initiative, with associated funding support and technical resources in exchange for hosting occasional educational visits from preservation professionals and students? Gloria considered it for exactly 1 day before agreeing. The funding that came with the designation didn't make the restoration easy, but it made it possible. Gloria hired a specialized plaster conservator for 2 weeks to address the most critical wall repairs, work that was beyond her technical capacity and which protected irreplaceable original material that would have been lost otherwise. She sourced period-appropriate replacement lumber from a salvage specialist Arthur knew in eastern Tennessee. She had the original windows carefully restored by a craftsman who worked exclusively on historic glazing. By the end of her first full year on the property, the house had been weatherproofed, structurally stabilized, and partially restored to a standard that Brenda Cook, on a visit in November, described as genuinely remarkable. Arthur, who chose his words carefully, said simply that it was the best private restoration work he had seen in 20 years of watching people try. Gloria wrote that in her composition notebook and read it twice before she went to sleep. Frank Harmon had always possessed an instinct for arriving precisely when something valuable was within reach. It was, Gloria had once believed, one of the qualities that made him a successful property developer. He could smell potential in a deal the way certain animals smell water, from a distance, through obstruction, before anyone else had noticed anything worth noticing. She had admired that quality once. She understood it differently now. He showed up on a Saturday morning in early December, 14 months after the divorce had been finalized. Gloria was working in the dining room, carefully stripping the original window casings back to bare wood, when she heard an unfamiliar car on the gravel approach. She came outside to find Frank climbing out of a new silver SUV, dressed in the business casual uniform he wore on weekends. Pressed chinos, a quarter-zip pullover, clean shoes that were entirely wrong for the muddy ground. He looked at the house with an appraiser's eye before he looked at her, which told her everything she needed to know about why he had come. Gloria. His tone was warm in the practiced way of a man who had spent decades using warmth as a negotiating instrument. This is quite something. I had to see it for myself. How did you find it? She asked. She did not move toward him or invite him closer. Marcus mentioned the magazine article. I read it. He paused, surveying the exterior. You've done serious work here. The historical designation, that was smart. I didn't know you knew about any of this. There are quite a few things you didn't know about me, Gloria said. Frank smiled in the way that used to disarm her and no longer did. He asked for a tour, and she declined. He asked how the restoration was being financed, and she told him that was not his concern. He shifted then, almost imperceptibly, from the warmth register to the practical one. I've been thinking, he said, about the divorce settlement. I want to be honest with you, Gloria. $28,000 was probably not adequate given everything you contributed over the years. I felt uncomfortable about it. Gloria looked at him steadily and said nothing. I'd like to make it right, he continued. I've spoken to a business partner of mine who specializes in historic properties. This house, properly finished, could be worth $300,000, maybe more given the designation and the grants attached. I'd like to propose a partnership arrangement. I'd bring capital for the remaining restoration. We co-own the finished property, and we split the eventual sale proceeds. No, Gloria said. Frank's expression shifted again, the warmth receding further. Gloria, be reasonable. You're doing this on grants and tax credits. You're living on site without proper utilities in a partially restored building. You're 63 years old. Let me help you finish this properly, and we both benefit. I said, no, Frank. This property is mine. The work is mine. You need to leave. He left. And 2 weeks later, a certified letter arrived from an attorney representing Frank Harmon, alleging that Gloria had used assets from the marital estate, specifically the $28,000 divorce settlement, to acquire and develop a property that had significantly appreciated in value as a direct result of historical designation and grant funding, and that Frank was therefore entitled to a proportional claim on the property and its associated financial instruments. Patricia, Gloria's attorney, read the letter and set it down on her desk with the careful deliberateness of someone managing their reaction. This is frivolous, she said flatly. The settlement was final. The money was yours to use as you chose. He has no claim on anything you built afterward. She paused. But he knows that. He's not expecting to win in court. He's expecting the cost and stress of defending it to make you settle. I won't settle, Gloria said. Then we fight. But I want you prepared. He can drag this out. His attorneys are expensive, and they know how to bury an opponent in paperwork. Patricia was right on every count. Over the following 4 months, Frank's legal team filed motions with the consistency of people being paid by the document. They requested financial records, grant documentation, correspondence with the State Historic Preservation Office, contractor invoices, and communications with Arthur Bellamy and Dr. Lena Park. Every request required response time, attorney hours, and money that Gloria should have been spending on a restoration. Marcus called in February, his voice carrying the strained neutrality of a man delivering a message he had agreed to deliver. Mom, Dad is genuinely trying to find a resolution here. He's not trying to hurt you. If you just consider a small percentage arrangement, even 10% of the eventual sale, this whole thing goes away. Tell your father, Gloria said quietly, that there is no percentage. There's no arrangement. And if he wants to continue this conversation, he can do it through Patricia. She hung up and sat in the half-restored parlor of her house, in the December quiet, surrounded by the evidence of everything she had built alone, and she did not cry. She made a list of everything she still needed to finish and got back to work. The story found its way to the public the way most important stories do. Not through a dramatic announcement, but through a quiet chain of connected people who each passed something along to the next person without fully anticipating where it would end up. Dr. Lena Park had mentioned the lawsuit to a colleague at the State Historic Preservation Office, not as gossip, but as a genuine professional concern, a frivolous legal action targeting a restoration project that the state had invested resources in was a matter of institutional interest. That colleague mentioned it to a friend who wrote a weekly column on preservation and development issues for the Knoxville Sentinel. The columnist, a sharp and thorough journalist named Dara Wilkes, looked into it and found a story considerably more interesting than a property dispute. Dara called Gloria in early March and asked for an interview. Gloria was hesitant. She had spent her entire adult life avoiding the kind of visibility that made people uncomfortable, managing her presence carefully in every room she entered to take up exactly the right amount of space. Not too much, never too much. But Patricia had told her that public attention was not necessarily a disadvantage in a case like this. And Arthur had said simply, "Let people see what you've built. It speaks for itself." Gloria agreed to the interview. Dara came out on a Tuesday morning and spent 4 hours at the property, walking through every room, photographing with her own camera, asking questions that were specific and well-researched in a way that told Gloria she had done significant preparation before arriving. She had pulled the divorce records. She had spoken to Brenda Cook at the Historical Commission and to Dr. Park at the Preservation Office. She had read Arthur's books and understood enough about architectural history to ask intelligent questions about the restoration methodology. The article published on a Sunday morning in late March under the headline, "She restored a forgotten house with her own hands. Now her ex-husband wants half." It ran on the front page of the Sentinel's weekend section with 4 of Dara's photographs. The exterior of the house, as it had looked in the county database listing, overgrown and abandoned. Beside a photograph of the same exterior now, cleared and partially restored, its original clapboard siding revealed and the porch rebuilt with period-appropriate materials. And 2 interior photographs. The parlor as it had appeared in Gloria's first documentation images, buried in dust and cobwebs, beside the same room now. Its heart pine floors refinished to a warm amber glow, its original plaster walls repaired, its fireplace surround cleaned and restored to reveal the extraordinary carved detail beneath decades of paint. The article was detailed and precise and devastating to Frank's position. It laid out the divorce settlement clearly. It described what Gloria had built from the $11,200 purchase price forward, the historic designation, the state grants, the federal tax credits, the Preservation Office partnership, the magazine feature. It quoted Dr. Park, describing the restoration as among the finest examples of private preservation work the office had encountered in recent years. It quoted Arthur, calling Gloria one of the most knowledgeable and skilled restoration practitioners he had worked alongside in his career. And it described the lawsuit in plain language that required no editorial commentary to make its nature apparent. The response was significant and immediate. The article was shared widely on social media, picked up by 3 regional news outlets, and referenced in a national preservation advocacy newsletter that reached professionals across the country. The comments and messages that came in split sharply. People who had experienced similar situations responded with recognition and fury. Preservation professionals responded with professional solidarity, and a substantial number of people responded simply with the particular emotion that comes from watching someone who deserved to lose be clearly, publicly, and irrefutably losing. Frank's attorney filed to withdraw the lawsuit without prejudice 18 days after the article published. Patricia called Gloria with the news on a Wednesday afternoon, and Gloria sat down on the restored parlor floor and pressed her back against the wall and breathed slowly for a long moment. "It's over," she asked. "It's over," Patricia said. He didn't want to go to trial with that article in evidence and public opinion where it was. His business reputation matters to him. This was becoming expensive in ways that had nothing to do with legal fees. Gloria thanked her, ended the call, and sat in the quiet of the parlor for a while, looking at what she had built, thinking about the 4 months of distraction and expense and stress that had been imposed on her for no reason, except that a man had looked at something she created and decided he was entitled to a portion of it simply because she had once been his wife. Then something unexpected began to happen. The emails started arriving. From women in similar situations, from preservation enthusiasts, from architectural history students, from people who had old houses and no idea what to do with them, and from several people with resources and genuine interest in what Gloria was doing and how she might be willing to expand it. The lawsuit had been meant to diminish her. Instead, it had introduced her to the world. The emails kept coming through April and into May, and Gloria read every one of them at the small desk she had built from salvaged lumber and positioned beneath the parlor window that faced east, the one that caught the morning light first. She read them before she started work each day, with coffee, in the quiet of a house that was becoming more itself with every week that passed. The messages came from everywhere. A woman in Chattanooga who had inherited a deteriorating Victorian and didn't know where to begin. A recently divorced woman in her late 50s from Memphis who had a background in interior design and was looking for something meaningful to redirect it toward. A preservation student at the University of Tennessee who had read the Sentinel article and wanted to know if Gloria would consider taking on an intern. An architectural salvage dealer in Nashville who had been following the restoration through the magazine feature and wanted to discuss a materials partnership. And 3 separate individuals, 2 private, one representing a small foundation, who asked, in varying degrees of directness, whether Gloria had considered teaching. She had not, or rather, she had not permitted herself to consider it, in a way that people who have spent decades being told implicitly that their knowledge is secondary learn not to consider the possibility that it might be worth passing on. But the emails made the consideration unavoidable, and Arthur, when she showed them to him on one of his regular visits, read through them carefully and said, "This is what happens when people see real knowledge being applied to real work. They want to learn it. What are you going to do?" Gloria thought about it for 2 weeks. Then she called Brenda Cook at the Historical Commission and Dr. Park at the Preservation Office in Arthur and asked if they would help her develop a structure program. Weekend workshops on historic preservation methodology for non-professionals, with the Calder Roadhouse as the living classroom. All 3 said yes without hesitation. The first workshop ran on a Saturday in June, 8 months after the lawsuit had been withdrawn. Gloria had expected perhaps 6 or 8 people. 19 registered. They came from across Tennessee, and 2 came from neighboring states, drawn by the Sentinel article and the preservation newsletter mention. They ranged in age from 31 to 74. Several owned old houses they didn't know how to approach. Several were recently retired professionals looking for purposeful work. Several were simply people who had read about what Gloria was doing and wanted to understand how it was possible. Gloria taught them for 2 days. She took them through every room of the house, explaining what she had found, what it meant, how she had assessed it, and what she had done to preserve it. She taught them how to read a building's construction history from its physical fabric. She taught them basic documentation methodology, how to identify original materials, how to research period-appropriate restoration approaches. She discovered with some surprise, a natural teacher, clear, precise, patient, and possessed of the particular authority that comes not from credentials, but from having actually done the thing being taught. At the end of the second day, a woman named Odalise, who had driven from Nashville with photographs of her 1910 Craftsman bungalow, sat across from Gloria at the salvaged wood table in the restored dining room and said, "I've been to 3 preservation workshops in the last 2 years. This is the first one where I felt like I actually learned something I could use on Monday." Gloria wrote that in her composition notebook that night and underlined it twice. It was in September, 4 months after the first workshop, that Simone came. She arrived unannounced on a Sunday afternoon, which Gloria suspected was deliberate. Arriving without warning meant there was no opportunity to be told not to come. She had her daughter with her, Gloria's granddaughter Priya, who was 13 and had apparently been asking about the house since reading a social media post about it that one of her classmates had shared. Gloria was in the side yard when they pulled up pruning back the overgrowth from the original stone foundation on the eastern wall. She straightened and looked at her daughter across the yard, and neither of them spoke for a moment. Priya broke the silence. "Is that the original foundation?" she asked, looking at the stonework with genuine curiosity. "It's hand-laid, right? From the property?" Gloria looked at her granddaughter with surprise and something that opened quietly in her chest. "How do you know that?" "I read the magazine article," Priya said, "and then I read the one before it, about vernacular architecture in the region. And then I found your name in the Preservation Office database." She paused. "I want to see everything." Gloria looked at Simone, who was watching her mother with an expression that carried the full weight of everything she hadn't said for 2 years. The remorse, the admiration, the complicated grief of a daughter who had chosen the wrong side and knew it, and was here now, standing in the yard of her mother's restored house, trying to find the beginning of a different kind of relationship. "I owe you more apologies than I can say in one afternoon," Simone said quietly. "I chose comfort over honesty, and I chose Dad's approval over being your daughter, and I'm ashamed of it. I'm not asking you to forget it. I'm asking if there's a way forward." Gloria considered her daughter for a long moment. "Come see the house," she said finally. "Both of you." She gave them the full tour. Every room, every restored detail, every piece of original fabric she had uncovered and preserved. She showed Priya the composition notebooks, all 7 of them now, filled with documentation and observations and the running record of a restoration that had become something larger than itself. She showed Simone the parlor fireplace around, the wide plank floors, the original plaster walls, the wavy antique glass in the front windows that caught the afternoon light and held it differently than modern glass does, softening it, distributing it, making the room glow in a way that no renovation could replicate. Marcus never called. Some distances, Gloria had learned, are chosen in ways that can't be unchosen by the person left behind. And the only dignified response is to stop waiting for a return that isn't coming and direct your energy toward what is present and real and worth tending. Frank remarried Tanya in the spring in a ceremony that Priya mentioned once in passing and Gloria received with complete neutrality. Frank belonged to a chapter that was finished. She did not hate him. She did not miss him. She felt, when she thought about him at all, the mild and distant recognition one feels toward a place one used to live, awareness without attachment, memory without longing. By the time the Calder Roadhouse was fully restored, 2 years and 4 months after Gloria had first unlocked the front door, it had been assessed at $290,000 and designated a contributing property to a newly established historic district that Brenda Cook had worked to have recognized. The restoration had been completed with a combination of Gloria's own labor, grant funding, tax credits, and the carefully managed contributions of the materials partnership with a Nashville salvage dealer. The total out-of-pocket cost, net of grants and credits, had been approximately $34,000 beyond the purchase price, less than the divorce settlement Frank had called generous. Second chances, Gloria had come to understand, do not announce themselves. They arrive disguised as disasters, as losses, as locked doors on abandoned properties that nobody else wanted. They require you to look at what everyone else has dismissed and see what they missed. They require the specific, accumulated, irreplaceable knowledge that you have been carrying and used for decades and believed was no longer relevant. It is always relevant. It is waiting. It does not expire. On the 3rd anniversary of her purchase of the Calder Roadhouse, Gloria stood in the restored parlor with Arthur and Brenda and Dr. Park and 14 women who had come through her workshop program, and she looked at the afternoon light moving through the original wavy glass of the front windows, and she thought about her father standing in old houses teaching her to read what others walked past without seeing, and she understood that the life she was living now, purposeful, skilled, entirely her own, had always been available to her. It had simply been waiting, like the house, for someone with the right knowledge and the right moment and the absolute absence of anything left to lose. She was 66 years old. She was exactly where she was supposed to be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.